La Horla, a short story published by Guy de Maupassant around 1887-ish, I believe is the theory.
And translated by Jonathan Sturgis. Coming up on the CodeX Cantina.
It should sound familiar for a lot of you out there. This is very reminiscent of the Diary of a Madman, written 50 or so years earlier by Nikolai Gogol.
So a little fun fact, because I don't speak French or really any language that well, I looked this up to translate what does Le Horla mean and how to pronounce it correctly for the video so I didn't look stupid, and that's not the original title of the story.
Oh, what is it?
Yeah, the story originally was Letter from a Madman, and I don't think it flowed that well, and Maupassant had to kind of rewrite it, re-jazz it up a little bit, and give it a different perspective, so the story made a little bit more sense.
On its own, I'll say this. The story just ratchets up tension, and it is definitely very panic-inducing, I would say. This is kind of like one of those psychological sketches that can, if you allow yourself to be absorbed into it, can be quite involving. I can't think of the right word to say.
Oh, I got you, brother. This one is claustrophobic. The whole time I'm just thinking, I feel like I'm in an elevator, or I'm like in a cavern or a crevasse or a ravine, and just like the walls are pushing on the side of me, and I'm just like, oh, please get me out of this. Help me.
Yeah, because, I mean, if you look at the plot at a high level, I mean, we're in a confessional story of a man. Is he going mad? It's kind of Poe-esque in a sense, where you're wondering what's reality as this guy is being very honest, but maybe even a little bit hallucinatory with what's happening. At least my theory is of that. But he's kind of like wondering and telling us about these situations of just like, is there an invisible entity out there that's drinking his milk and water? And he starts creating these like little traps with white cloth and dirtying his hands to see if he did it or if someone else could have done it. And he starts coming to these theories about there being invisible parasites potentially infesting his brain and attempting to take over, and kind of lands on this idea of a La Horla, an outsider, an invisible force that it seems to want to do harm in a sense. And so he kind of sets traps and tries to set the house on fire with La Horla in it, and eventually commits suicide in a sense.
There's a lot of ways we can go with this. I do want to start off with saying it's interesting that you said the word confessional. That's another thing. If you're in a confessional, they're very small, enclosed, tight spaces, and sometimes a little uncomfortable because you're spilling all of your dirty laundry, usually to a stranger, trying to be forgiven for your sins. And that leads us into kind of the other ideas that you'd mentioned here of he's confessing these things to maybe alleviate. Is this sin coming back to haunt him? What is this life force that is sucking his will to live? Is this real? Is it imaginary? Is it his sins coming back to haunt him?
Let me ask you this. Is La Horla a real thing, do you think? In the context of this story, is it real?
I think in his mind it is real. I think that it alludes to mental illness, hallucinations. Maybe there is some type of parasite. Maybe he has syphilis or a brain worm, a tumor. I think there could literally be something physical in the story, in his world, that is influencing him, yes, that is not supernatural.
So you think, in your interpretation of the story, there is no existence of supernatural forces?
Reading through the story one way with a specific mindset that this is not a sci-fi story, yes, I think you can come to that conclusion. Can you read it as a story that there is a supernatural element, a ghost, a demon, an angel, a vengeance, that is ruining this guy's life, leading him to commit suicide? Yes, I definitely think that as well.
It can be, I think, hard to have some of those discussions sometimes, because it's like someone tells you there's this invisible ghost that can't be detected in your room. Okay. How do you prove that? It's an invisible ghost, can't be detected, right? Like, how do you get this external source or a second source that proves that this supernatural thing exists? And he even like concocts these experiments with like this white cloth and the dirtying of his hands. And he's like coming to these really strange.
Yeah.
conclusions at the book, the pages that move, and even like the rose, right? Like he tries to grab the rose and it's just not there. There's something to be said about a difference in our perception of what we think and maybe things as they actually are. And that still doesn't answer supernatural, right? But first of all, let's agree that, do you agree that there is perception? What we think is happening may not be what things actually are as they are happening. Do you agree that there might be a difference in perception and reality?
100%. Definitely could be a difference of what is reality, what is your interpretation of reality, and then what you can prove in reality. I know gravity exists because I drop something and it hits on my foot and I'm hurt, I'm in pain, but I can't explain gravity. Very few people can explain. We can't even prove really what gravity is. So I think that, yes, in this context of this story, that is true.
So the number 2, did you notice how often it came up in this story?
Oh, I didn't count. I had the actual book. So you were reading it on the Kindle?
No, I had the physical book, but it came up 23 times in my copy.
Wow.
We have 2 English schooners that pass him by. We see him sleep 2, maybe 3 hours before he has these visions. And then after he has the visions, it was 2 hours later that he was aroused. He enters the pathway between 2 trees. He sees 2 hills in the difference, where there's 2 goats bleeding, one with a man face, one with a she face. When he pours oil on the floor, comes from 2 different lamps. When he seizes the roses, then he's not sure the difference between reality and unreality, whatever the word is there. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? There's 23 times the number 2 comes up. And I think duality, this idea of reality versus our perception, is something that I kind of wanted to explore in this discussion with you, because, when we look at like this dual existence, dualist in a sense, there's perception, right? Like when I look at a stick in the water, it looks like the stick is bent. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. I remember doing that. You put your straw in the cup, right? And you'd see the straw bent. Yeah, I remember doing that as a kid.
You pull it out and you realize the straw is,
straight. Yep.
So as a young kid who doesn't know, you might be like, oh, does the water bend it? Right. So you put your hand in there and you feel that it's straight, and then you look at your hand and, oh my gosh, my hand is bent too.
It broke my bone.
So, as we get older, there's certain things that we learn where perception, what we perceive, is not reality, not things as they are. The stick is not bent. My hand is not bent. It's our perception. We learn about how water impacts bending light and stuff like that. So the question is, how many differences are there between our perception and things as they actually are? And how do you measure those differences? It reminds me a little bit of The Truman Show. Remember, the entire world for this character in this movie was made for him to think his life was a certain way. But it was all an act. It was all a TV show. He had no idea everyone he interacted with were actors. His town was fake. Everything was fake. The sky was even fake. And when he realized it, right, his world came crashing down to him. He realized how big of a difference there was between perception and reality. And that's, a funny, quirky, extreme situation. But there are gaslight situations. There are situations such as there's a controversial book out there called Uneducated about a woman who was lied to by her family her entire life, that she started to really have a dissonance between what was actually happening to her, what actually did happen to her, because everything that did happen, everyone around her lies and tells her that's not really what happens. So now she's questioning her perception. Her view of reality doesn't seem to line up with things as they actually are.
So who's right? I guess that's what it comes down to this story is he right? Is he wrong? I mean, there's a lot of evidence there that there's obviously something that is influencing him, whether it's supernatural or not. It could be a parasite. It could be, what if he was a twin and he had his twin still inside him and it was influencing him? I mean, you could, there's some very outlandish theories as well. What about alternate realities where, he is so in tuned with a parallel universe of himself, that he's interacting with himself in a parallel universe. There's some pretty cool theories out there to this duality, and even like the idea of mirrors. Like a lot of people, there's some sketchy stuff when you look in mirrors, and you ever look at a mirror sideways and you're like, I'm not even facing the mirror, but I can still see myself because of the way light refracts and our perception and interpretation of what we can see.
And I think the pragmatist sides of us says, okay, what's real? Let's look for an external source. Let's look for another person to verify, or a way to judge whether something is true or not. Because it's kind of like there's invisible ghosts in my room that are undetectable. Okay, how do we test for that? And the pragmatists, well, I mean, they're undetectable, says, well, it's not that it's right. It's not that it's wrong. It's a meaningless statement, right? Because I can't prove if it's right or wrong. And I think that's kind of where the horror element of this comes in, is this man has this undetectable supernatural force that can't be proved. Immanuel Kant, an old, philosopher, would have said there's the phenomenal world, what we can measure, and there's the noumenal world, what we can't measure. And I don't know, to me, there has to be a noumenal world, right? Because the self, me, I think there's enough evidence to show that I don't know even necessarily the true me myself. Like when I look at like what my desires are, when I trying to understand where does that want of chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream come from, like we can't see those impulses. How I make decisions, or even why I made certain decisions, like the internal self is kind of unknowable in a sense. That's the noumenal world, and the world that exists as it is, the stick that isn't bent, that's the reality, right? And there's always going to be a difference between these two, is kind of like what Kant is kind of saying. And he thinks that you can get to know that noumenal world through certain experiments. And it's interesting how this guy is going through these different experiments, trying to understand this external world. But when does the human mind, unchecked, unbalanced by other sources, become unstable? And when does it realize it need to accept the limitations in its own perception? And I think this is a story where one man's journey, unchecked, unbalanced by other people, becomes violent. It becomes destructive, and it becomes madness, and it becomes fatal.
I think that's the norm, though. And I think you hit the nail on the head here of that it's one man, unbalanced, with nobody else. What is the greatest punishment that we give criminals? Or what is maybe the worst punishment that you give to your son right now? Solitary confinement. When you are alone.
I would say taking away his Pokemon cards, but
oh yes, I've played Pokemon with him. He does love those cards, but if he had nobody else to play with them, eventually, they may not be so much fun anymore. But I think that's the thing, is when you're trying to prove to someone else, you're trying to prove it as much to yourself as well. Because if you get that validation that they see it as well, hey, you saw that, right? I'm not crazy. That is real. That gives you more satisfaction. It grounds you in reality that this is truly happening, because we want these experiences, maybe good or bad, to just be real. Whether it's a good experience or bad experience, I just want to know that it is something that is genuine. And I think that when you're all alone and you have nobody to say, no, it's okay, it's not really there, but I can help you pass this, it's scary, it's frightening. And that's where you get that horror element, I think, to the story. And yeah.
But isn't it a little bit cheap to say that too, right? Like if we look at The Truman Show and we look at Uneducated, what does it mean when other people get to gaslight us and get to define our reality? Isn't it also a little bit scary that what we check against other people can also be manipulated and can completely undermine this relationship that we have of like the phenomenal world and the noumenal world? It's almost unfair that we have to check against others in a sense too, because that data source could easily be manipulated and can cause serious harm.
It comes down to trust, right? I have to trust that, what I say with my wife or with you or, with our viewers, that we're going to get not the response that we necessarily want, but one that is almost anticipated, either reaffirming or not. Hey, did I turn the water off? No, you didn't. But what if I really did?
to me, why this story I loved and hated at the same time is one, I think it's interesting to note how we hate, or we can't trust, I should say, outside sources, right? Because those can be perverted. But the story also highlights how even our own internal senses, like when he reaches for the rose and it's not there, how our own phenomenal world can betray us too. Because the odds of me reading the story, it was last Tuesday, I'm sitting there reading about these events that are happening. And I think I've told you before that I had an event that happened to me about 5 years ago where I had to go to the doctor because I started to like have these like things that were restricting my vision. I'd, not be able to stand up straight. I'd vomit. I thought I was dying. I thought I had brain tumor, right? My mind unchecked on myself. I go to the worst possible situation, probably like this guy.
Like many of us do, right?
I get a CAT scan. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a brain tumor, and it comes back totally fine. And it's just, I had what's called ocular migraine. So in my mind, I'm having a migraine in the part that processes vision. And it's throwing off my experience of how I've known to trust this world forever. My vision's betraying me. And reading a story about that, not only have I experienced where my own senses betray me, I literally got a splitting head migraine as I'm reading this, which is kind of weird.
Reaffirming.
I don't have them too often. I only have them maybe every 6 months now. So I start getting these vision auras of not being able to see like the bottom left part of the screen is how I experience ocular migraines, like the first signs. And I'm like, oh crap. So I have to like run and go take my meds real quick. And I keep trying to read it. And this guy is experiencing this world through senses that are betraying him, I think, how I interpret the story. And that's how I'm reading this story. And I'm like, my Lord, Maupassant must have had migraines because this is perfectly, exactly how I experience the world too sometimes.
Do you think the story induced a migraine in you and this was a self-fulfilling prophecy?
That's actually a really interesting question. I want to say no because I want to believe that my ocular migraines come from a place of physicality and not necessarily mentality, but I don't know. I'm not a doctor on that sort of thing.
I didn't have anything, I think, to the severity that you have, but I know that I don't handle stress all that well. And I remember a year or so ago, you and I had a conversation, I guess, and I don't remember it at all. And I had talked to my wife a few times and had conversations and they were just gone. And I always kind of prided myself on my intellect and my ability to remember things. And these conversations that I were having with, family and friends were just gone from my memory. And you guys say they happened, but I have no recollection of them. So I have to just trust you that they did. And it's very unnerving. So I definitely understand that.
Yeah. So ultimately, La Horla, the outsider, like a word that was created through a combination of French words to be this invisible, undetectable force. I get this story and love this story because it really shows and highlights, one, the betrayal of our own senses, but two, the infallibility of others too can be a little bit scary too, relying on others who might have had imperfect experiences. It can be a very unnerving sense of reality sometimes. When 99% of the time I got my blanket on, I'm good, I'm comfortable. It's that 1% of the time when I'm going through my existential dread that this story really speaks to, I think.
If I rewrote this today, I would do it as phantom phone vibration. That's what I would call it.
All right, guys, we're going to leave a Maupassant playlist down below for you to check out other talks of his. Great writer. My name has been Una. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Peace out.
Crypto out.